Picture this. A cargo aircraft descends through thick gray clouds over a frozen airfield somewhere in eastern Russia. The runway lights flicker in the early morning darkness. Snow blows sideways in the wind. Inside the aircraft's cargo bay are dozens of sealed steel containers. No markings, no flags, no country of origin. Ground crews move fast, faster than normal military protocol would allow. Trucks roll forward before the aircraft even fully stops. Within minutes, the containers disappear into covered convoys heading toward rail terminals. Thousands of miles away, Ukrainian radar stations suddenly begin detecting something unusual. Supply trains, massive ones. Not Russian, not Belarusian, Chinese freight rail cars. Analysts stare at the screens, trying to understand what they are seeing. Because this shouldn't be possible, China has officially declared neutrality in the war. But the trains keep coming. More convoys, more sealed cargo, more unexplained shipments crossing the Eurasian land corridor toward Russia's western military districts. And then comes the twist. The equipment inside those containers is not labeled as weapons. It's labeled as dual-use industrial machinery. But within weeks, battlefield drones begin appearing in Ukraine using components that trace back to those shipments. Unexpected action. Unexpected result. China never shipped weapons. But it may have changed the war anyway. This is not a scene from a movie. This is not a rumor. This actually happened. Russia, China logistics transfers reported through Eurasian rail corridors, January, February 2024, documented by international trade monitors and Western intelligence assessments. What you just witnessed is one of the clearest signals that the Ukraine war is no longer just a regional conflict. It is becoming a system-level confrontation where supply chains, industrial capacity, and geopolitical alliances are beginning to shift in ways few expected. Because wars rarely collapse from a single catastrophic moment. They collapse through cascading failures, logistics failures, economic failures, political failures, systems slowly turning on themselves. And what makes the China connection so important is not simply that equipment may be flowing toward Russia. It is how it is flowing, quietly, indirectly, through legal gray zones that blur the line between civilian trade and military supply. Not missiles, not tanks, but the industrial backbone that keeps a war machine running. And that changes the strategic picture dramatically. Today on World Brief Daily, we are going to break down exactly what happened and what it means for the future of this conflict. Stories like this move fast. New intelligence, new battlefield developments, and new geopolitical shifts appear almost every day. If you want clear, evidence-based breakdowns of what is actually happening in conflicts like this, make sure you subscribe to World Brief Daily and enable the bell icon so you never miss an update. Now, let's start with the facts on the ground. Let's start with the specific incident that triggered the alarm. On April 10th, 2024, investigators from Reuters published a report revealing that Chinese companies had exported large quantities of drone components, microelectronics, and industrial machine tools to Russia throughout 2023 and early 2024. These were not small shipments. According to customs data analyzed by Reuters, Chinese exports of CNC machine tools to Russia exceeded $68 million in 2023, more than double the level recorded in 2021, before the invasion of Ukraine. Why does that matter? Because CNC machine tools are the backbone of modern weapons production. They manufacture precision metal parts for missiles, drones, artillery systems, and aircraft engines. At the same time, analysts at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace reported in February 2024 that Chinese firms were supplying Russia with microchips, semiconductors, and optical components that had become difficult for Moscow to obtain under Western sanctions. And the scale is striking. Trade data cited by Newsweek showed that in 2023 alone, Chinese exports of semiconductor devices to Russia reached over $300 million, making China the single largest supplier of advanced electronics to the Russian market. Then there are the drones. Investigations by Foreign Policy Research Institute and the Ukrainian outlet Ukrainska Pravda in March 2024 documented multiple Russian reconnaissance drones recovered on Ukrainian battlefields that contained Chinese-made engines, cameras, and flight controllers. None of these components are technically classified as weapons. That is the legal loophole. They're labeled dual-use goods, civilian products that can also be integrated into military systems. Chinese officials maintain that Beijing does not provide lethal military aid to Russia. And technically, that statement may be true. But the data reveals something far more complicated. A sanctioned war economy struggling to produce modern equipment, suddenly gaining access to the exact industrial inputs it cannot manufacture itself. Not tanks, not missiles, but the machines and electronics that allow those systems to exist. The loss of a single shipment will not swing the strategic balance, but the story of how these shipments are moving tells us something enormous. Now zoom out, because a few shipments of electronics do not explain a war that has already consumed entire armies. So let's look at the scale. According to battlefield estimates compiled by Reuters and defense analysts cited by Foreign Policy Research Institute, Russia had deployed roughly 190,000 troops around Ukraine at the start of the invasion in February 2022. By mid-2024, Western intelligence estimates placed the total number of Russian personnel committed to the war at over 470,000. That is more than double the original invasion force. But the cost has been staggering. Ukrainian military assessments cited by Newsweek estimated that Russia had suffered over 315,000 total casualties by early 2024. Think about what that actually means. If even half of those casualties represent soldiers permanently removed from combat, Russia has effectively burned through the equivalent of its entire original invasion army. And the equipment losses tell a similar story. Open-source military tracking groups referenced by Forbes documented the destruction or capture of more than 2,700 Russian tanks, 5,200 armored fighting vehicles, 120 aircraft, over 9,000 military trucks and logistics vehicles, and those are only visually confirmed losses. Now consider the production problem. Before the war, Russia's domestic defense industry could produce roughly 200 to 250 new tanks per year, according to analysis from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. At the current rate of losses, Russia would need over 10 years of production just to replace what has already been destroyed. 10 years for equipment lost in two. And that assumes factories operate perfectly, without sanctions, without shortages, without industrial bottlenecks, which they do not, because modern weapons are not built from steel alone. They require microchips, optics, sensors, navigation systems, and advanced machine tools. Exactly the categories now appearing in Russia's trade flows with China. Think about what this actually means. If Russia loses 10 tanks per day, that equals 3,650 tanks per year. Even if Russian factories somehow doubled their production to 500 tanks annually, the math still collapses. Losses outpace production 7-1. And manpower follows the same equation. A war consuming hundreds of soldiers per day demands a constant flow of replacements. Russia does not have 20 years of manpower reserves, and it does not have millions of trained soldiers waiting to replace them. Russia does not have the time, and it does not have the people to sacrifice. Before we go further into the structural mechanics of how this war machine is being kept alive, make sure you are subscribed to World Brief Daily and have notifications enabled. These deep dive briefings track developments that often move faster than the headlines. Now, here's where the story becomes far more revealing. Here is where it gets into territory that Russia's own propagandists cannot easily explain away. Because the Russian military system was designed for a very specific kind of war. Short, violent, decisive. Not long wars of industrial attrition. Unlike NATO, which operates on a decentralized logistics network where dozens of allied countries produce interchangeable parts and equipment, Russia operates on a highly centralized defense structure. A small number of factories produce a small number of critical systems. And that works until those factories hit a bottleneck. which is exactly what began happening after the invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. Western sanctions targeted the Russian defense supply chain almost immediately. According to reporting from Reuters in October 2023, Russian missile manufacturers were suddenly struggling to acquire advanced semiconductors, precision bearings, and optical components. Not steel, not explosives. Tiny pieces of technology that modern weapons cannot function without. Here's where it gets interesting. Unlike Western military supply chains, which can substitute parts from multiple allied suppliers, Russia's system depends heavily on specific imported components. When those components disappear, the entire production line stalls. Think about how that cascade works. Missile factories slow down, drone production stalls, guidance systems become scarce, and suddenly the battlefield begins to feel the consequences. Analysts from the Foreign Policy Research Institute noted in 2024 that Russian forces increasingly began using commercial electronics scavenged from household appliances to replace sanctioned chips in military equipment. Washing machines, dishwashers, consumer-grade cameras. This is not speculation. Recovered Russian equipment in Ukraine has revealed exactly that. But here is the deeper vulnerability. Industrial wars are won by supply chains, not speeches. And Russia's supply chain has become narrow, fragile, and sanction dependent, which creates a predictable feedback loop. Shortage leads to improvisation. Improvisation leads to failure. Failure leads to more losses. More losses create more shortages. A cascade. And this is where China enters the equation. Not by sending tanks, not by sending missiles, but by filling precisely the gaps where that cascade begins. Microchips, machine tools, drone components, industrial electronics. And Ukraine has learned to exploit exactly this vulnerability. History shows that this pattern is not new. Large military systems rarely collapse all at once. They fracture through supply failure, industrial exhaustion, and strategic overreach. One of the clearest examples appears during the later years of the Soviet-Afghan War, which lasted from 1979 to 1989. At its peak, the Soviet Union deployed roughly 115,000 troops in Afghanistan. According to archival research cited by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, the Soviet military lost over 15,000 soldiers and more than 450 aircraft and helicopters during the conflict. But the true damage occurred behind the front lines. The war drained resources from an already struggling Soviet economy. Defense spending climbed above 15% of the entire Soviet GDP during the 1980s. Factories that were supposed to modernize the civilian economy instead fed the military machine. The result was not a battlefield defeat alone. It was systemic exhaustion. As Soviet economist Nikolai Shmelev wrote in a widely cited 1988 analysis of the Soviet economy, the military burden is no longer simply heavy. It has become structurally destructive. Within 2 years, the Soviet Union began withdrawing from Afghanistan. Within 3 years, the Soviet Union itself collapsed. Here is another example. During 1944, Nazi Germany attempted to maintain large-scale armored warfare despite catastrophic industrial losses caused by the Allied bombing campaign against Germany. German tank production actually increased during parts of that year. But something strange happened. The tanks increasingly lacked fuel, spare parts, and trained crews. Military historian Adam Tooze documented that by late 1944, nearly 40% of German armored vehicles were immobilized, not by enemy fire, but by mechanical breakdown and logistical shortages. Think about what that actually means. The weapons existed. The system to sustain them did not. The pattern is consistent, and it is accelerating. Zoom in from the macro to one person. Meet Sergei Kovalenko, a 32-year-old Russian drone operator stationed near Bakhmut, Ukraine, in March 2024. Sergei was trained to operate sophisticated reconnaissance drones equipped with advanced optics. But by early 2024, the drones arriving at his unit were increasingly built with improvised electronics, components scavenged from consumer devices, and Chinese dual-use shipments. He recalls in an interview with Ukrainska Pravda, half the time, The equipment breaks down before the mission even starts. We are told these are top of the line parts, but they aren't. Not really. Kovalenko was not alone. Entire units found themselves grounded, waiting for replacement microchips or flight controllers that never arrived on schedule. This is not just one man's story. This is what the system does to people when supply chains collapse, but the political orders continue. Soldiers trained for precision are forced to improvise with unreliable tools. Morale drops. Mistakes multiply. By late March, Sergei's battalion had lost over 40% of its drones due to mechanical failures rather than enemy action. The devastating single line? Even when you have the people, the will, and the training, a broken system renders them powerless. And so we arrive at the place where all of these threads converge. China's quiet shipments, Russian industrial fragility, the staggering casualty rates, equipment losses that outpace production, historical patterns of systemic collapse, individual soldiers caught in failing supply lines. They're all connected by a single, inescapable truth. Wars are not fought by will alone. They're fought by systems, and when those systems fail, the strongest armies crumble. We've seen it in Russia today. The reliance on a narrow set of factories and imported components has created a feedback loop. Shortages cause improvisation. Improvisation causes failures. Failures lead to more shortages. Losses multiply geometrically. Cascades, one after another. Think about what this actually means. Russia cannot replace 2,700 tanks destroyed or captured on the battlefield with its current industrial base. Russia cannot train and supply hundreds of thousands of troops indefinitely. Russia does not have 10 years of perfect industrial output, and it does not have millions of soldiers to throw at the war. And yet, here comes China, indirectly providing the precise dual-use machinery and microelectronics that slow down this cascade, but also subtly shift the balance. Not by giving weapons, but by sustaining the war machine just enough to prolong the conflict. The impossible math is clear. If Russia loses 7 pieces of equipment for every one it can replace, the war becomes self-defeating. If soldiers are lost faster than they can be trained, the human cost spirals. And the formula is devastating. Russia wanted rapid victory. It got attrition. Russia wanted operational autonomy. It got supply dependence. Russia wanted industrial control. It got cascading failure. The structural trap is complete. The feedback loops are accelerating. And yet, most observers are still counting tanks, missiles, and headlines, not realizing the war is being fought and lost in the invisible layers of industry, logistics, and microelectronics. Here is the final, philosophical line to remember. In modern war, control over the invisible system determines the outcome, long before the first shot is fired. We will, of course, keep you updated here on World Brief Daily as this situation evolves. The flow of dual-use Chinese technology, the pressure on Russian production lines, and the battlefield consequences in Ukraine are not slowing down, and neither is our coverage. Thank you for watching and staying informed. Your attention matters because understanding the mechanics behind conflicts is the first step in seeing the bigger picture. Now, we want to hear from you. Is China's indirect involvement a clever strategic move or an accidental consequence of global trade? Drop your thoughts below. We read every comment. If you found this breakdown helpful, check out our related video on how sanctions shape modern wars, where we dive into the economic feedback loops affecting military conflicts worldwide. Remember, subscribe, hit the bell icon, and stay tuned to World Brief Daily. Stories like these move fast, and the next shift in the Ukraine war could be around the corner. Thanks for watching.